What's up, folks? So we are back to another session. And as you guys can see the title screen, we are starting on section 5, which is Firewall Authentication. All right. And so, of course, you guys seen a FortiGate. And what we're going to go over today, we're going to just do a little intro today. It's going to be a short session. And we're going to go over the methods of firewall authentication. Right. So it's mostly covering just theory. Right. And so after completing this section, right, you guys should go ahead and be able to achieve what you guys see on this slide right here. And the big thing, right, is if you guys demonstrate competence of these different methods of firewall authentications. By the way, we're going to do labs on some of these. Some of the labs we're unable to do. Like something like two-factor authentication and using 40 tokens or what have you. We won't be able to lab that. So I encourage you guys to go ahead and do your reading and actually burn it into memory what it is as much as you can. I know it'll be hard, just so you guys can go ahead and pass the exam. Okay. But you guys learning this, you guys be able to walk into an enterprise environment and add value and say, hey, these are different methods. I can go ahead and use Google Foo and try to draw up a architecture on how to do it. You guys can actually, add value. All right. So let's go ahead and roll out. So let's go ahead and start. So traditional firewalling grants network access by verifying the source IP address and device, right? And so if, I work for Don's company, right? He has a firewall and he has a switch connected to that firewall, and I connect my PC to that switch that connects up to the firewall, right? If Don configures firewall authentication, I'm going to get that small screen that you see in the bottom right-hand corner, right? And so although this is a type of security, right? This is good, right? It also, right, is inadequate and can pose a security risk because this is a certain type of method, right? And this would, what you guys see right here as a spoiler is that Don created a local username and password for myself, right? And for all users, right, to go ahead and log in, right? Very unsecure or what have you. Real simple. It may be in plain text, right? And so, right, it's has network security engineers that you guys are growing into. This poses a security risk because the firewall itself cannot determine who is using the device to which it is granting access, right? It may be my Kivia's computer, but I'm on it. You know what I mean? So we're unable to go ahead and identify that. In the same breath, right? The Fortigate, it includes authentications of users and users groups. So Don can go ahead and create that, right? But then it's you can log into multiple devices, and there's so many things, right? As far as just using this one method of firewall authentication, that we want to go ahead and look at these different methods, and that's what this section is for, right? So let's go ahead and keep rolling, right? And you guys will see how this screen would pop up on a user's PC and how all that works. And you guys seen a little bit about it before this, but this is going to go ahead and include, a firewall administrator like Don, who would go ahead and create a firewall policy, maybe for northbound traffic from inside the network to outside the network. And he would put a user and a user group, right? And maybe an IP address range, right? And it would go ahead and provide, right? Give that captive portal of, hey, go ahead and log in with using the password that you configure, right? And of course, with those profiles, say, hey, I'm going to allow or deny access to specific network resources, okay? But let's go ahead and look at the different methods because, of course, local password authentication isn't the only one, okay? So we got these three, right? We have local password authentication, username and password stored on the Fortigate, okay? We have server-based password authentication, which is going to be a fun lab, by the way, that we're going to do on Tuesday, also called remote password authentication, and two-factor authentication, right? If you guys aren't familiar with it, it's a system of authentication that is enabled on top of an existing method, right? And so, it's basically we have users, right? We have end users that may know a password that they created, along with typing in a password, right? It's also going to be another factor of verifying that some, this person that is logging in is who they say they are, right? So whether it be a token, whether it be a device or what have you, it's two factors, right, to authenticate who someone is. Okay. And so, you'll learn in detail so much about all these two-factor authentication. Like I warned you guys, we will only be able to talk about theory, okay? But it's enough, it's short enough theory so that you guys can consume it and be ready for the exam. The main thing I want you guys to see, not just for the exam, but of course for your future, is the server-based password authentication using things like Radius, LDAP, and AttackAct server, because you guys will be troubleshooting that a lot in the field as network security engineers, and of course configuring that as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and move forward. So I told you guys, right? The bare bones quick method for firewall authentication is, right, local password authentication, right? And the example that we use is that, I work for Don Enterprises, right? And he has his company, right? And Don, being the network admin and the CEO at the same time, right? He configures, right? Don is very, very old, right? By the way, he's an old man. So he does things old in an old way, right? So he creates all 348 employees in his company. He creates local usernames, right, on his Fortigate, right, which is the simplest method of authentication, right? So he creates these user accounts on the Fortigate. It's stored locally on the Fortigate, right? And it works well for a single Fortigate installation, but most people have more than one Fortigate in their environment, okay? And so to go ahead and do it, right, because we're going to have to roll through, and we're going to do it one time in the lab, right, is that he'll go ahead and create a local account under the user definition section of a FortiGate, right? And as soon as he clicks that, right, it'll take you to a wizard like you guys can see, right? You'll start at, if you look at the top right, you'll start at, it'll ask you, hey, are you trying to create a local user, remote radius user, remote TACAX user, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? He's going to click on local user, right? Don is going to go ahead and create a username and password, right? He can add additional information like if he wants to enable two-factor authentication, as you guys can see in the bottom, in the middle of the PowerPoint, right? And of course, once he does that, he creates the user, right? Maybe he can put maybe he put him in a user group that he can create. He can do that as well. Once he does that, the user is created. Okay, and as you guys can see on the left side of the screen, every time a user would go ahead and log in, right, that's within the subnet, right, behind the FortiGate that's pointing towards the local area network, you're going to be authenticated, right? You put in your username and password that Don created. That password is shot back up to the authentication server. This authentication server in this deployment, being the FortiGate, gets it, authenticates you, sends back down, hey, authentication, okay, we acknowledge it. We're going to go ahead and give you access. Okay, so this is local password authentication, right? It's one of the most simplest forms. Now, one of my favorite forms, which of course you guys should make your favorite forms too, which is server-based password authentication, which uses a remote server. Okay, now, from a foundational level, right? Anything can be an authentication server. Anything can be an authentication client that passes, credentials to an authentication server. Okay, I want you guys to stick that in your head. Anything can be an authentication server, and anything can be an authentication client that passes authentication requests from end users. Okay, here's what I mean by that, right? You guys heard of Linux servers, Windows servers, right? That we can go ahead and configure usernames and passwords or what have you, right? But that's not the only thing that can be a remote authentication server. You can actually configure a switch to have username and passwords, and to have all those values, and that'll be your authentication server, right? And you'll configure your FortiGate to say, hey, Mykevia, within Don's company, another security network engineer, she configured a switch with all these local username and passwords. Mykevia is old as well, but she's young in spirit, right? And so she configured this switch with all local usernames and passwords, and Don created the FortiGate to say, hey, to authenticate our users, send these requests, authentication requests, to Mykevia's switch, right? So that switch can be that remote server, right? Okay, so just keep that in mind. I don't want you guys to be stuck on, oh, a Windows server can just be it. It's not as rigid as it sounds. Okay, so that's my little tangent about some of the foundational knowledge at 1,000-foot view of authentication, right? So now let's go ahead and get into the bare bones of it. Any questions so far?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is something that you're going to touch on, but is it a server-based password, like the server more reliable because it's not stored locally? Like the information, is that the reason why it's more reliable?
That's one piece. That's one piece.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And we're going to touch on it, and we're actually going to see it in packet captures, right? But you'll see that, there are some hashing algorithms that are with some of these requests using Radius, TACX, or what have you, that they go ahead and hash and encrypt some of the requests, right? So me being you guys end users at Don Enterprises, right? If you guys using a remote server, one of the benefits is using one of these protocols, and it'll go ahead and hash this hash and go ahead and encrypt my username and password combo whenever I sent it up to the remote server through the authentication client.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
And I know it's gonna make a little bit more sense once you guys see it in the lab and see you guys go ahead and see that you guys see those packet captures and these configurations that we do. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Good question. Right. And we're going to be on here for a while. When a server-based password authentication is used, right? A remote authentication server authenticates users, period. Okay. And so what will happen is Mykevia, being that network engineer, she'll configure the FortiGate, right, with information about the remote server, right? She'll configure it. She'll go ahead and confirm that she can reach it. She can talk to it, right? And you guys will see how to configure that. Once she does it, right, she can go ahead, right, and now create groups that match it, right? That match the groups that were created on the server, that remote server, and then your users will be authenticated, right? And they don't have to be locally made, right? She can just create groups, put people in groups on the remote server. That group on the FortiGate matches a group on the remote server. You got your authentication without her having to manage maybe 500 users, right? Or 40, groups within a server. Okay. And what it's doing, right? What that remote server is doing, and that quote unquote FortiGate that'll be in the middle, as you guys can see on the PowerPoint, is it is validating those credentials. It is evaluating and say, hey, I'm going to push this request up there, take a look at it. Oh, okay. The remote server says it looks okay. Send it back to the FortiGate. Hey, you're okay. You can go ahead and use the internet. Okay. But the security thing, and hopefully, Don, I'm answering your question. The big thing is with server-based password authentication, the FortiGate does not store any user information locally at all. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And as I told you guys, of course, these are the different types of remote authentication server. You got TACX Plus, you have LDAP, you have Radius. You also have POP3, so you can go ahead and use a POP3 server. Of course, it'll require a full email with domain name. I think that's just a suffix, right? You can go ahead and do that and use all these to go ahead and authenticate your users remotely. So you have all these options. In our lab, we'll go ahead and mostly do LDAP, right? Which will give you the foundational knowledge of how remote authentication servers use. And once you understand just how that process works, um, I'm confident, right, in every engineer that's on this call, you guys will, and that's watching this, you guys will be able to go ahead and look at a, Fortinet, FortiOS technical documentation and replicate, right, on how to configure Radius, how to configure TACX Plus, right? But of course, I'm not going to tell you you'll be experts. You will have to do some, research on what Radius and TACX is and POP3. But after this, after you see how it's done with LDAP, you guys will be able to do it with every other protocol. Okay. So I won't go deep into this page. Some of this are spoilers that you guys can see, but this is basically how you go ahead and configure this, right? You go ahead and create, a group, right? That group will be called, quote unquote, a user, right? You point to it. You already have your servers, right? Configure on your FortiGate, right? These screenshots actually doesn't do server-based password authentication configuration justice, but in our practical lab, you guys will see it, right? And so just to go ahead and touch on everything, right? You'll create user accounts on the FortiGate, right? That user account is not going to be the actual user account. It'll be a group that you're referencing, right? On the remote authentication server, you'll add users to those groups and they'll authenticate. No user accounts and password will be configured on the FortiGate when using this method, okay? Now, two-factor authentication and one-time passwords, okay? And so traditional user authentication, it requires you to use like your username, right? Plus a password, right? And so with this, right, what happens if I go to Starbucks and, somebody just is, shoulder surfing and just sees everything that I typed or maybe records it, right? Now they have my username and they have my password, right? And so with that, there's a lot of security vulnerabilities, and that's just one method to go ahead and steal my information, right? Some people can go ahead and use different types of attacks like um, keystroke methods to go ahead and see what I'm typing, to go ahead and store my password, right? Get what I'm typing. There's so many things, right? That's where the benefits of two-factor authentication comes in, right? It requires me to know a password, but also something that I have, right? And so a network security admin like Makivia, she goes ahead and implements two-factor authentication, right? And so now, right, it's also she's requiring all her end users to use a token or certificate, right? And so what this does, she's taking away from her entire network security framework. She's taking away, hey, we're not leaving it up to passwords to protect our organization and the end users. We're saying we're making it a little bit more complex for attackers. We're saying, hey, you're also going to have to use something that you have or some other method to authenticate who you are that only the user can use to authenticate, right? And that's just not the password, right? And there's different methods to go ahead and use these two functions, right? You can use a text message, right? That maybe sends one-time passwords, OTPs, right? You can go ahead and have, certificate. Maybe that certificate is pushed down to all your end users using a group policy from whatever server they use, maybe Linux or Windows Server, right? Maybe she goes ahead and gives everybody in the organization a token, right? A 40 token, maybe it's a software token or a hardware token. She can do all of these things, right, to harden, right, the security efforts within her organization, right, and within you guys' organization with two-factor authentication, right? All these things are great to add, right? One of the major things you need to understand is that whenever you implement two-factor authentication or one-time passwords, you have to make sure on your FortiGate that an NTP server is configured, right? It's not just recommended, it's configured. I've been on a almost 4-day TAC call trying to understand why my users can't authenticate and they're having there was one error, it's a time error, right? And come to find out my NTP server was misconfigured, right? And I was pointing to an NTP server that was in the wrong time zone. So very fun stuff. You can implement all of these things. And my golden rule, like I told you guys, is that every vendor will let you do anything on the device that you want to. It is you that is the engineer that architecture all of this. Okay. Right. And so we just spoke about two-factor authentication and different methods to go ahead and authenticate. 40 tokens, right? Fortinet provides their own solution to go ahead and implement two-factor authentication. You have 40 tokens. And so within a token, if you guys ever use it, it uses a specific algorithm to go ahead and generate a one-time password or OTP. Okay. So that person will go ahead and, put in a static password, right? Then they'll go ahead and be prompted, hey, put in your OTP, right? And that token, like you guys can see, top left-hand corner, would go ahead and be shown, right, on a time scale to your end user. They'll go ahead and get it. They'll type it in, and boom, they validate. It's sent to the validation server, aka the Fortigate. And that server at the same time is sent to your, remote authentication server, right? At the same time, right? And these are all the different factors, right? Your validation server, being your Fortigate in this case, is syncing with your NTP server, right? Because the Forti tokens are all set up with that NTP server. All of these things are being done, right, at the same time to go and authenticate your end users, right? And as you guys can see at the bottom, you guys won't, you guys don't need to know this in detail, right? But what happens, right? And if you guys can go ahead and see, is that the two things that consist within an algorithm is a seed and the time, right? A seed being that unique, the unique random generated number that does not change over time, right? And the time obtained by an accurate internal clock, right? And so that clock is going to be synced up on the token and on the FortiGate, aka the validation server, right? They're synced up. So whenever that end user puts in that one-time password, right, or OTP, right, from the 40 token and that static password that they have for their account, all of these things are happening in the background. Okay. All right. So,
Yep.
And again, it's real simple to go ahead. Once you, of course, talk to your vendor, you buy your token, whatever you want to use, right? Of course, we're talking about Fortinet. So, of course, we're going to go ahead and push the 40 token, right? And once Mykevia goes ahead and assigns, right, 40 tokens, right, from the FortiGate and says it, this is how it's synced up, right? That 40 token is synced up to the FortiGate and it's assigned to actual users, groups, etc. Okay. Um, and as you guys can see, right, it's you can use that mobile token, aka the software token, or the hard token, the actual 40 token device, right? And it'll be go ahead and synced up by then, right? Um, so it's real simple, right? I suggest you guys to go ahead and read over it. One major thing that you're gonna have to know um, for your career, and of course for the exam, is that you cannot register the same 40 token on more than one FortiGate. Okay, so definitely keep that in your minds, and also remember that for deployments and future architectural designs that you guys do. Okay, and so if you guys are thinking, hey, what if I do want to use a 40 token on multiple devices, right? To go ahead and combat that, you would just go ahead and have, right, design wise, a central validation server, right? Maybe you go ahead and use a solution like Forti Authenticator, right? You go ahead and use that, then it can go ahead and be that central authentication server versus or central validation server versus just one FortiGate, right? And then once you implement something like Forti Authenticator, you go ahead and point all your FortiGates to the Forti Authenticator. Everything is synced up, right? Of course, it's going to add a little bit more steps to the process of how people get authenticated. But again, it won't be assigned to just one FortiGate, and you'll increase mobility for your end users to go ahead and connect to any network, different sites, or what have you, and so on. Okay. All right. So you guys learned about a lot of things and heard me talk for a long period of time, right? And so we have active authentications, right? And we have passive authentication, right? Active being user receives a login prompt, right? And you go ahead and manually enter credentials to authenticate, right? Whether that be local storage of passwords on the FortiGate or using a remote authentication server. That is an active authentication method, right? A passive, right? User doesn't receive a login prompt from the FortiGate, right? These credentials are, they're determined automatically, right? And automatically being, maybe there's a certificate that was pushed from a group policy from a server, right? And it sees that certificate, automatically authenticates these users. Or if you're using, single sign-on, right? FSSO, of course, being Fortinet single sign-on, or RSSO and NTLM. These are different methods for a single sign-on, of course, using a certificate, 802.1x, etc. Right? And those are passive types of authentication. Okay. And with that being said, right, we have completed methods of firewall authentication. Now I'm going to ask you guys 2 questions, like we always do, to review what we went over. Okay. So question 1, which firewall authentication method does FortiGate support? Is it A, local password authentication, or is it B, biometric authentication?
A, local.
There we go. All right, you guys been listening. I'm happy. All right. Question 2. Which type of token can generate OTPs to provide 2-factor authentication to users in your network? Is it A, FortiToken mobile, or is it B, USB FortiTokens?
A.
A.
Damn, you guys are listening. I'm actually scared. But guys, that is, again, I told you guys today was going to just be theory. That is the methods of firewall authentication. Of course, we always have these discussions. I go ahead and share theories, but I am human as well. So I do have the, I am susceptible to go ahead and miss some things. So please go back, read this section in your study guide, try to replicate in your lab. But starting on Tuesday, we're going to go ahead and cover remote authentication servers and user groups at the same time. And we may be able to go ahead and capture authentication using firewall policies and authenticating through captive portal. So all of this is going to be covered in one lab. We're not going to do no theory on Tuesday. Then Wednesday, we're going to go ahead and review all the theory. So then you guys will be able to go back when I'm talking and say, oh, I know what that is. All right?
Yep.
All right. All right, guys. I'll go ahead and stop the recording.